Ethical Perspectives on the News is produced by the Interreligious Council of Linn County, which is solely responsible for its content. The views and opinions expressed on this program do not necessarily reflect those of the staff and management of KCRG TV9.
Good morning and welcome to Ethical Perspectives on the News. My name is Diehl. I'm the current president of the Interreligious Council of Linn County. On this morning's show, we're going to be talking about gender identity and our youth. And here to discuss this very relevant, I would say controversial, and sometimes complex topic, I have three distinguished guests with me. And so I'd like each of you just to introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about what you do and why this particular topic is important to you.
So hi there, my name is Dr. Heather Morgan-Sowada. Just call me Heather. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm an associate professor of marriage and family therapy from Mount Mercy University for our marriage and family therapy program, both master's and doctoral. And I also have a private practice here in Iowa called Resolute Therapy, where I work with individuals, couples, people, everyone, and all concerns. But something that's extremely near and dear to my heart that I'm very passionate about is working with the trans and non-binary and gender diverse community. And again, working with youth, children, teens, young adults, couple systems, family systems, where gender identity or concerns around it have become something that maybe the family or the couple system is struggling with in their life.
Thank you, Heather.
Hi, I'm Jules Robinson. My pronouns are they, them, and I'm non-binary. I'm very passionate about making sure everyone is welcome, loved, and accepted, and that they feel that they belong no matter who they are and how they identify. I turned this passion into action by leading a walkout at my school in support of the LGBTQ+ community and in opposition to the anti-LGBT bills being proposed.
Thank you, Jules.
Hi, I'm Rabbi Esther Hugenholtz. I'm the rabbi of Agudas congregation, and we are an LGBTQ affirming congregation. My pronouns are she, her, and this is really important to me because I think often the voice of religion needs to be represented more broadly, and the voice of our tradition is one of affirmation, and I look forward to explaining why that is.
Well, wonderful. Again, thank you all for agreeing to discuss what is, again, a pretty controversial topic these days and something we're hearing about all the time. And so I think, Jules, you kind of already referenced the fact that there are multiple legislative bills in the Iowa legislature right now. Some of them have moved on, others are pending, et cetera. But certainly there's a number of them, right? So it's a very hot topic, highly divisive. And Iowa isn't the only state where this is, where our legislatures are kind of wrestling with this. And so I think it would be good just to kind of start with, and Heather, I'll come to you on this one. I think for a lot of people, and I know for myself, as I'm just kind of familiarizing myself with the different ideas surrounding this topic, I think there's a lot of people that don't just have familiarity with certain terms, certain concepts, or maybe have kind of an idea in their head, but maybe not a correct one. So I think to kind of ease into the conversation, could you talk about what I think are kind of the three main terms that I came across as I was researching, and that is gender identity, which is also already listed in the title of the show, gender expression, and gender dysphoria. Could you kind of help educate our listeners on those three, and then maybe as how that applies in your practice and how you address it?
Sure. Well, gender identity is something that, I almost want to start with how sex and gender are often, unfortunately, very conflated, right? Individuals will believe that the sex that you were assigned at birth is going to be then how that person identifies with their gender, and that never changes, when in reality we know that the sex that you were assigned at birth and your gender identity, right, sex assigned at birth is based on chromosomal, genetic code, right? It's based on anatomical pieces, based on genitalia, right? But gender identity is how you see yourself, it's who you are in your heart, it's who you are in your mind. And so those things are not necessarily always going to be in line with one another. We know that across different cultures, including the United States, people identify with various genders, and that the idea that it's this binary, you're either assigned male or female at birth, and that is just how it always is. We just see across many, many, many cultures. I would argue all cultures, that gender is very nuanced, and even that sex is very nuanced. And so hopefully that explains a little bit. Gender identity is really how you see yourself, whether that be in masculine or feminine traits, right? And again, those are very stereotypical statements as well, right? Socially constructed ideas of what masculinity or femininity is. But and then one thing I think that is important for people to understand too is the difference between cisgender and the idea of cis and trans, right? So someone who identifies as cisgender is someone who was assigned their sex assigned at birth. They're still aligning with that same gender identity, right? That there's not a difference between the two. Someone who's transgender, because cis is just Latin for same, right? So same that you identify, that you were given at birth, that you identify now. And trans is Latin for across, right? So meaning that that person is kind of across from the gender that they were identified or assigned at birth, that they're identifying as a different gender, or and then I believe, so you talked about gender identity, then gender expression. Well, gender expression is just how we express ourselves outwardly in the world, right? So again, individuals might lean, and it goes anywhere on a spectrum. I tend to lean a little bit more into femininity, right? As a cisgender female, I have an appreciation for my femininity. I like to kind of like do things like wearing longer hair, doing makeup, things like that. However, I can have a cisgender female friend who maybe leans more into a stereotypical masculinity and doesn't see the purpose of, hates having long hair, and doesn't see the purpose of doing makeup, or wears more stereotypically masculine clothing. But again, I think we need to fight against that, because clothing should just be clothing, right? Like toys should just be toys. It doesn't have to be this binary idea. And then gender dysphoria is when there is this extreme internal distress, when the individual feels that the gender they were assigned at birth does not align with their gender identity that they have, again, in their mind and their heart. And due to the lack of being able to express themselves in the way that they desire, they feel this marked distress that leads to things like anxiety, depression, social anxiety. At the most extreme and at the worst end are suicidal thoughts, self-harm, substance use and abuse, in order to cope with really awful feelings of not being able to be true to who they are, their authentic self, or be accepted by their family, friends, community.
Yeah, excellent. Well, that was a great introduction for us, and I think helps hopefully for the listeners lay some groundwork when we start using these terms, right? So I think this is a good opportunity, Jules, to kind of bring you into the conversation here, right? So we talked about, Heather talked about, gender identity, expression, dysphoria. I'd like for you to maybe just kind of speak to your own personal experience around, discovering your gender identity when you kind of first started expressing that. And was there some dysphoria during that period, right? Discomfort or disconnect between, what we talked about there. So maybe just kind of share with us and our listeners how that, your experience there.
Yeah, of course. So, I came out last year as non-binary to my family and friends and the community and all. And it was definitely a scary process. It was hard because you never quite know who is going to support you in those times. But my parents do support and love me for who I am, and it was really nice in that way. But I know not everyone goes through that. Not everyone has supportive parents like that, but I am thankful for mine. Um, But yeah, I have felt gender dysphoria. It has been hard, because I don't feel like I fit into an exact gender. Of course, I may wear more feminine clothing, but I don't always feel that way. I don't feel like I specifically fit in one. And so it was really hard, like seeing all my female friends just like acting this one way, and like dressing feminine, while my male friends dressed more masculine, of course. And it was like I didn't feel like I fit into either of those groups. And so I did feel like a disconnect. And I didn't feel like I, and I felt like I was too masculine at times for my female friends, or too feminine for my masculine friends and all that kind of stuff. And so it has been hard, but I found the right group of friends and they support me and everything. So yeah, it's been really a long journey, but yeah, it's been pretty good lately.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think sometimes there's this idea that, there's all this confusion around gender identity today, but, kids from generations ago never went through that. And I'd say it seems like, no, that's not the case, right? It's just that now we have terms, now we have ideas, now we have kind of diagnosis, if you will, around what, the different things that people are experiencing. So we're just being able to kind of talk about it intelligently and openly, right, as a society. So, Rabbi, you have a unique perspective on this. From a religious perspective, some of the conversation that you hear around this is definitely has some religious basis to it, as far as maybe thoughts the Bible may have on gender, on sexuality. And so I'd wonder, what is your opinion on that from as a Jewish rabbi? Uh, just what's your perspective?
Well, first of all, I cannot represent the entire Jewish perspective because there are many perspectives in Judaism, and I want to give credence to the fact that there are people who may see it differently than I do. But overall, in the liberal Jewish world of which I'm part, there is a sense that we want to be affirming and that we can root ourselves, at least in some authentic interpretations of the biblical texts and the rabbinic writings, to do that. Now, of course, the biblical text, and we're talking about the Hebrew Bible here, which people in Christian culture would call the Old Testament, we call it the Hebrew Bible. That there are many different expressions and perspectives and tensions in that text. The Bible is not just any one thing. That is why people across philosophical spectrums can identify with the Bible, right? So I also want to be intellectually honest about that there is a conservative voice in the Bible, there's a radical voice in the Bible. But I think what the Bible's primary concern is that we see expressed in Genesis 1:27 is for justice and dignity of the human person, irrespective of who that human person is. We Jews really believe that was our gift to humanity, this idea of universalism, that even though nations and cultures are distinct and the Jewish culture is distinct, we have this overarching frame for universal inclusivity, right? That all human beings are created in the image of God and derive fundamental rights and dignity from that. So gender, to go back to that specific verse where we are told we are created in the image of God, says male and female, God created them. And of course, you could read that in a binary way. And in many ways, for many centuries, it has been read in a binary way. But you can also break down that binary and read it in a spectrum. There is a literary device in the Bible called merism, where you basically take two extremes to describe a spectrum. So day and night, that also includes dawn and dusk. Light and dark, that also includes twilight. The mountains and the sea, that also includes the fields or the forests, for instance. That's a literary device that you see a lot in biblical literature that encapsulates an overarching, all-inclusive idea. And so, yes, you can say male and female as a binary, but you can also say God created humankind, male and female, to show that there is a spectrum. But certainly, if you look at the character of someone like Joseph, in our parlance today, we would call him genderqueer, right? We would consider him gender nonconforming, which is a huge drive of who he is and the hero he is in the biblical text. Now, if we fast forward to the Talmud, which is the rabbinic corpus of interpretive and legal writings from about 1500 years ago, the Talmud already deals with gender as a spectrum and not as a binary. The gender spectrum that the Talmud recognizes is about 6 genders. Some of those are physiological observations about what the ancient rabbis saw, what we would call intersex people, or different kind of physiological responses of the body, and how this physiological diversity interlinks with the gender expression and gender identity. That is already noted in our ancient rabbinic texts. And Judaism has no problem with acknowledging that there is diversity and that this is a spectrum and not a binary. In more traditional communities, the conversation is had slightly differently. But
Right.
in our communities, that leads us to be completely gender egalitarian and LGBTQ affirming.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, so I think we're a little over halfway through, and I think what would be interesting now is to really try to focus the conversation, maybe for the last half of this, around specifically the youth part of this, right? Which is probably the most controversial right now. But we have Jules on to give a great perspective on that. But I think there's a question, as I was researching this, and I'll come back to you, Heather, on, that a young person's gender really their identity begins to form at as little as like 3 or 4 years old, and so on and so forth. But I'm not the expert on this. So Heather, do you want to talk a little bit about what we know when it comes to young people, children forming their gender identity and how early they begin to express that?
Yeah, so you're correct in that we see young children sometimes as early as 2 years old, but 3 and 4 years old, who have very distinct ideas about their gender identity. And that can often, sometimes that comes in stereotypically masculine or feminine things, because we have kind of, as a society, imposed like this is what a boy wears or a boy does, or a girl wears and what a girl does, that type of thing. But we see very young children having very distinct, very persistent and insistent about their gender identity from a very, very young age. And what we do know about young children who have, or I should say maybe prepubescent children who struggle with gender dysphoria, who have maybe they have a strong desire to socially transition at a young age. And when their parents are affirming of that, when their parents are allowing them to explore their gender identity, they do extremely well. And one of the things that I think is really important, that makes me feel really frustrated, that I hear all the time in media today, is this idea that we need to protect children from medical interventions being imposed on young children. And I want to be very clear that if you are to read the WPATH standards of care, so WPATH is the World Professional Association for Transgender Health, and they're a subsidiary of the World Health Organization. So if you go to WPATH.org, anyone can read the standards of care. There's version 8 that was just released. And you can see very clearly that it is not recommended to have any non-reversible medical treatments being done to children. That's something that they wait, and that there is a very distinct process with a team of medical professionals, including things like an endocrinologist, therapists that are working with the child, working with the family, to be able to really process and help this child to have a safe space to explore their gender identity. But really working with a family physician and an endocrinologist to be able to see, okay, when might this child be ready for something like hormone blockers, to be able to give them a little bit longer of a period of time for them to be able to explore their gender identity and see, do I want to more socially transition in different ways than maybe I already have? such as maybe going by a different name or using different pronouns, or if maybe they've only been wearing different clothes than might be stereotypically accepted for whatever gender they were assigned at birth, right? And so I think it's really, really important for people to understand that these decisions to have any kind of medical affirming care are not being willy-nilly. Like, doctors aren't just throwing hormone blockers at children or throwing hormone replacement therapy at children. They're made very diligently and intentionally in an informed consent process after appropriate blood work has been done, to be able to see, like, is this child or inappropriate, to see, like, is this child at Tanner stage 2 of pubertal development before any type of puberty suppressing, any puberty blockers are introduced. And then before any type of hormone therapy is introduced, is this child, is their body at a point where they can grow and sustain these types of hormones safely? So again, it's not just this willy-nilly happening, and any kind of surgical affirming care. The World Health Organization, and again, it really reinforces that every situation needs to be individualized, just like that would be the case for any type of patient in any kind of healthcare system, is that it should be individualized based on that specific person, based on what they are needing to be their best and healthiest version of themselves. But they do not recommend having any kind of surgical procedure until the age of 18. And again, when that happens before then, there's been long-standing, consistent, persistent, and insistent gender dysphoria and social transitioning and probably hormone replacement therapy, all of that's been happening for years.
Yeah.
So people think that these things are just, they're having all these awful, procedures on children and doing sex change operations on children, and it's just that's not what's occurring, and it's in place of fear, and I think ignorance in the process.
Yeah, I think there's, you hear a lot about the social contagion. It's just the cool thing to do, so I'm going to go have a sex change operation. So I think maybe, Jules, it'd be great to bring you in here. So a couple things. First of all, when did you, how old were you when you really began to start to question this in your head? And then secondarily, kind of what I was talking about, this social contagion, well, it's just cool to be to be non-binary or to have a different different gender identity from your kind of cisgenders, right? Could you kind of talk about those from your own personal experience?
Yeah. I don't even remember when I started thinking about, like, all my my identity and everything. I think it really started in even like 5th and 6th grade. But yeah, I just like realized that I didn't feel like a certain gender, it just like I didn't feel like I fit into one, and I was like, okay, wait, this is weird.
Yeah.
Why is like everyone different? Why am I different than everybody else? And so it was definitely a learning process. Like I am non-binary, and other people aren't, and I'm just like, wait, this is like not normal, whatever, because like everyone's grown up that way to think male and female, not non-binary, gender fluid, and everything like that, So yeah, it was definitely a learning process, but there is definitely there is still stigma, but it definitely has gotten better throughout the years, and in high school and everything, it's definitely people are just more aware of identity and everything and what people really go through. So
what do you say, Jules, to somebody that says, well, it's just the cool thing to do, it's a passing fade, you're just confused? Maybe you've had people say that to you, but if you didn't, how would you respond if somebody does say that?
Yeah, I have been said, some people have said that to me before. I'm just like, if it was just like a thing that people do, for fun, if it's just like a trend or whatever, I don't think anybody would be doing it. Like, I don't think people would want to be this way, because it's hard to go through like this stuff, and people are just like, oh, it's just a phase. Like, I wouldn't go through this if I could, if I could just change that. So, and just some people don't understand, and it can be hard, but like, we just need to like spread awareness of it and just make sure that like people do understand.
Yes, no, thank you. Well, that's excellent. So we just have a couple minutes left. I think what I'd like to end with is maybe going back to you, Rabbi Esther, and talk a little bit about what advice or thoughts you would give to parents. And Heather, I think closing with you on the same question. When parents are dealing with this with their young person, whatever the age may be, we'll say it, under 18, what advice would you give to them?
So I would say, first of all, seek out professional medical care, because in the Jewish tradition, we value evidence-based science, and I am not a medical professional nor a therapist. So that's what I would first do, say, seek out reliable medical care, someone like Dr. Heather. Second of all, I would say your child is wonderfully and beautifully made in a divine image, and the Jewish tradition is here to support you and to love you and to love your child and validate the child just as they are. And we have rituals and community to support that. So you do not need to feel alone in that. We have your back. I think being us physically or metaphorically being able to put our arms around people when they feel isolated and alone and say, God loves you just the way you are. This community loves you just the way you are. And you should be given the freedom to figure this out for yourself, and know that there is a religious voice in the religious community that welcomes that.
Thank you. And Heather, 1 minute for your closing comment on what parents should be doing.
I think at the end of the day, it's so important for parents to have an understanding of, we often focus on the horrible stats of what these young individuals who are trans or non-binary, gender diverse, what they go through with suicidality and urges to self-harm, depression rates, and whatnot. But I think what we also need to help parents to focus on is how these kids thrive, and not just survive, but they thrive and they blossom and they bloom into just these amazing beings when they're given the space to be true to who they are. And, as one parent said to me, do I want to have a child at 18 who's attempted suicide multiple times, who's identifying the way that they were when they were born, or do I want to have a child who's happy at 18 and thriving, even though that means that they're quote unquote different, right?
Yes.
And they're like, I'll take the difference every time. Like I'll take this version of my kid because that means I get to have my kid.
Well, thank you, Heather, and thank you all three, Rabbi Esther, Jules, for participating in a subject that, again, very complex, and certainly something we could talk about for hours probably. But again, I hope our listeners learned something this morning, and hope you have a great Sunday. Thanks for tuning in. Take care now.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you.